we'll start here, and certainly as folks filter in, we'll welcome them as well. So my name is Marcel Laflamme. I am part of the open research team at PLOS. I'm happy to be serving as kind of moderator for our conversation today. And just to say a little bit about sort of where this webinar comes from, I think at PLOS we're really thinking about how open science and the advantages, the benefits of open science look different across different research communities. And so even as we really think of preprint posting as something that has broad benefits sort of across the science system and beyond for other types of users as well. We're really trying to pay attention to the dynamics of that in different research communities who publish with PLOS. So the chance to kind of be here today with our partner EarthArXiv and with this great panel of experts to really think about preprints in the context of this particular space, right? So the kind of research that's going on, the ways that it circulates, the expectations that researchers have about that. So yeah, that's sort of the motivation for why we're here. I'll just offer kind of just a few kind of housekeeping preliminaries. So we have enabled automatic captioning for this webinar. So you're welcome to enable that on your side as an attendee if that's useful for you. We are also recording this session. So we'll plan to share the recording with registered attendees afterwards, as well as likely to share it on the PLOS YouTube channel. So yeah, for those who weren't able to make it synchronously today, we'll want to make sure that there's a record of that that can sort of live beyond this hour that we're spending here together. I'll say a bit about format. So we'll kind of structure this as sort of a roundtable discussion between the three sort of panelists who are here and who I'll introduce presently. But then we'll sort of save time, at least a good 15 minutes towards the end of the hour for your questions, for those of you who are here. So what I'd encourage you to do through the conversation and as questions or comments come to mind, to just use that Q&A feature in Zoom to record that. We'll sort of collect those there through the call and then work our way through those in that last 15 minutes or so. So yeah, feel free to use that Q&A feature throughout and know that those will be seen and captured. And then just kind of a few words about expectations and just wanting this to sort of be a respectful and welcoming space for all attendees. And yeah, if there are any concerns about that environment, you can message me in the chat privately and directly, and we'll certainly follow up on those either during the span of the call or afterwards. So with that, let me introduce the speakers for today. So we have with us Emma Archer, who is a professor at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Emma is also the editor-in-chief of PLOS Climate. So welcome, Emma. We have Anne Rowan, who's a professor at the University of Bergen in Norway. And Anne is part of the advisory council for the preprint server EarthArXiv. We were talking a bit just before we got started about how that came to be. So I'll give you that as a teaser, sort of an interesting story there. But Anne will tell us a little bit about EarthArXiv's efforts to sort of promote preprint adoption in the earth science and climate research communities. Our third speaker is Monica Granados. So Monica is the assistant director for the Open Climate campaign at Creative Commons, which thinks about preprints and sort of a broader range of kind of open research outputs and practices and their importance in advancing climate research. So yeah, really pleased to have these three speakers with us today. with that, I'll stop sharing my screen so we sort of have this gallery view. And I'll just sort of kick us off then and ask, maybe to get us started for the three speakers, could you tell us a little bit about kind of how you engage with preprints, right? So whether that's as an author, a reader, or you know, in any other capacity, when did you first start engaging with preprints, and maybe how has your thinking about them evolved over time?
I'm happy to get started. So interestingly, I have a PhD in ecology, so I was a researcher before I moved into my role more in open scholarship. And I really saw the pathway to open access through like gold and green routes through publishers or institutional repositories. And it really wasn't until I helped found this organization called Pre-Review that uses preprints to foster greater diversity in the peer review process, that I really got engaged in preprints. It was really eye-opening to see how an entire ecosystem of making knowledge more accessible can be built around preprints. And to me, that was incredibly exciting. And pre-review was just one of that aspect. So looking at how could we provide ways for people to review preprints at a stage when, you know, this feedback could be taken and integrated into the manuscript from all sorts of reviewers, not just the three reviewers that might read your paper in a traditional scholarly review process that may be mediated by a journal. And you asked the question of like, how has it changed? You know, for me, it was just like, oh, this is a way to make your work open access without having to worry about potentially article processing charges. But now I see it as like, is this a way for us to kind of help reinvent the scholarly communication system by building on top of manuscripts, or building on top of preprint manuscripts, and building an entire ecosystem that supports ways to elevate these manuscripts so that, you know, they're reviewed, you know, the statistics are reviewed. We could add, you know, code within them. You can make them dynamic. It's just really exciting. I think now what can be built around preprints more than just another way towards open access.
So maybe I can go next. I mean, I have to admit that preprints were not really strongly on my radar in terms of my own discipline until I would say about 5 years ago. I knew about them in the context of colleagues in, if I remember correctly, geology and nuclear physics, who were making in South Africa. So I think every country probably has different kind of rates of adoption between different disciplines. So here at nuclear physicists and some geologists were using them and mentioning it. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, it started to become much more evident. Some of the work I do is related to the big international assessments on climate change and biodiversity. And there is a strong time-sensitive aspect to getting some of the material from those out, but also some of the publications, partly because at the end of every year, the big multilateral environmental agreements have their conference of parties. So quite a lot of the time you want to try and get things into the readership. So that's been really great. It's been an amazing educational process for me. We've on one of the international assessments I've worked on, we use Zenodo, which I believe is a bit more data oriented. And then last year we had a time sensitive paper that we wanted to get out to be read by governments prior to the conference on biological diversity COP in Montreal. And so we made use of EarthArXiv, and that it was fascinating to see that pop up and to see how quickly people started reading it. It was really fantastic.
Yeah, so I'd agree. I mean, I've been thinking about preprints over a similar timescale to Emma, and my field is glaciology, mostly, and some glacier climate interactions. And we had the EGU launched their discussion journals, which was the first sort of, my first awareness of this was the cryosphere discussions, where it was brilliant to suddenly see papers, that you could contribute to the peer review of, or say, have you seen this, or have you, and some really interesting discussions were set up in there that wouldn't have happened otherwise. We also, for a longer period, we've been using data sharing platforms. Zenodo is a great example where there are community groups in my field sharing data on a similar topic that can then be combined. So we do this a lot of the time, this arduous field work. We go and work in remote mountain ranges on glaciers, which is expensive in time and resources to get there. And so if you can then share those data and someone else can use them for something else as well, I think that's brilliant.
And do you want to say a little bit about EarthArXiv in particular, and sort of what brought you to kind of be involved with that preprint server in particular?
Yes. So very simply, I think EarthArXiv is a really good idea. I've been aware of preprinting as something that physicists did, and I think arXiv itself has been going since the early 90s, but there was nothing in earth science. The cryosphere discussions, as I mentioned, had this problem that was quite frequently come across, I think, where if your paper was rejected, even up to a few years ago, it meant it was difficult to submit elsewhere. And I think I wanted to be involved in a better way of sharing science, and EarthArXiv is a lot of fun. So I volunteered to be part of the advisory council. They have a process which means you volunteer and then you are randomly selected to take part. So I'm not sure it's on merit, but they do also aim to have a diverse representation of people on their advisory council. I'm not quite sure how that works, but I was very glad to take part and to learn more and hopefully share this with my wider research community. I think we've been somewhat slow in taking up preprinting so far.
Great. That sort of leads into my next question for the three of you. Right. I mean, this sense that adoption of this particular open science practice has, right. I mean, we know a bit about its sort of origins in physics in particular. And right, you can find climate research on arXiv that goes back to the early 90s. But right, like it feels like it's really been in the last few years that we've seen these kind of dedicated servers for the earth sciences, right? So EarthArXiv, EGU's repository, AGU has its Earth and Space Science Open Archive. So yeah, I guess I'm curious for the three of you who are in this space, do you have a sense of what might have catalyzed this period of heightened activity, right? Why is it, do you think, that maybe in these past 5 years, this sort of heightened attention to preprints? And is there anything you can share with us about kind of trends that you're seeing around the adoption of preprints by climate researchers in particular? Emma, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I mean, so we're definitely seeing increased uptake. I should mention it's geographically, I think still pretty variable. So I think certain countries and certain regions have got more comfort levels with the adoption of with the use of preprints than others. But definitely on an upward trend. I mean, we've looked at the figures for PLOS climate as well, for example. I think a couple of things are driving it. I think partly the wish to put something into the public domain and readership on a time sensitive manner is something that more and more researchers are interested in for a range of different reasons. I think the other thing is related to something that we're obviously very interested in the PLOS journals, which is providing a more diverse readership, perhaps. Obviously, I mean, PLOS is not a particularly good example because it's much more on the open access side. But of course, I have seen readers in the climate sciences who have been looking to publish in something that really in many developing countries, people wouldn't be able to afford to read. So I also think that there is a strong and increasing sense among climate services, not just to diversify authorship, but to diversify readership. I think preprints are a really important tool in that regard. I know something that we're going to be interested in is seeing how many decision and policy makers are making use of preprints as readers, as opposed to just the kind of normal traditional readership.
I'm interested in many of those questions. I don't think we have a good quantification of the uptake of preprints in climate science as part of the Open Climate Campaign. That's something that we want to look at. We have data on the number of papers in climate science, climate change research that are open access, that are like versions of record. We have a little bit less of an data on preprints, but that's something that we're working on. Very anecdotally, I would say that probably across most scientific disciplines, there is this increasing comfort with preprints. And I do wonder if that's catalyzed by the COVID-19 pandemic and the uptake of preprints during the pandemic, for the reasons that we all talked about and are going to talk about a lot, I think, in this webinar, is the power of putting something out there in less than a year time, which is sort of the average time it takes to get a paper from submission to the version of record published on a journal's website. Bianca Kramer has done some work monitoring the number of preprints across a couple of different preprint servers, and the growth has been more than linear. It's pretty amazing. What you can see after March 2020 in terms of uptake of preprints. And so I think the community, the scientific community at large, is getting more comfortable with using preprints. I mean, I think we still have a ways to go for preprints to be considered an output that is equal to a peer-reviewed publication. But it seems like, as you know, and I'd love to hear everyone else's thoughts, but the way that sort of the culture works in science is like, what are my peers doing? What are they comfortable doing? If they're doing it, then I'm going to do it as well. There's no sort of like prescriptive rules. It's really sort of like the culture of either your institution or your discipline. That's why physicists do it, and they don't really even think about, like, of course we're going to preprint. We've just been doing it for so long. That's like not even a question. And I've also seen it anecdotally even in my own research. I remember when I was a PhD student, talking to the senior author on some of my preprints and saying, "Oh, we should preprint this," and they would be very reluctant, or they would say, "Oh, yeah, sure," but after it's been accepted. And now I see them preprinting all the time, and so it's really neat to see how I think that just kind of like culture has changed, even though there hasn't really been a policy change.
Yes, I absolutely agree with Monica, but I think the cultural change is important because, I mean, I think as journals in the last few years have started requiring open data, maybe scientists become a little more happy with sharing what they haven't published. And I think actually noticing the benefit of an open discussion and peer review of a preprint is once you see how that can benefit your work and how you can have a better paper before you've even submitted it to the journal. I think that's really exciting. And then the awareness also that you can update your preprint, so it has a DOI. It's if you submit it to EarthArXiv, but it's not final. If you revise it in the publication process, you can revise your preprint as well. You can replace it with a newer version. So it's not something scary, hopefully, anymore, in a way. I would also add that I think for submitting funding applications, you want to present your most recent work, and to be able to say, it's not published, but this is what I've just done. I think that's brilliant. That's much better than saying, or even if you're writing a second paper, to say, rather than just say, trust me, this is in progress somewhere else. You can actually say link to the preprint with a DOI and say, here it is. You can see what I've done, even if I only did it last week. That's brilliant.
That's great. Yeah, a little bit more confidence in that than just saying sort of in review and sort of leaving it at that. Emma, were you going to chime in there?
Yeah, I mean, something I've been thinking about, I do think that the, adoption of preprints, or the increasing adoption of preprints, is also part of a wider move in science, including climate science. So this notion of preprints is equal to a peer-reviewed publication. I think more and more scientific and academic institutions, not all of them by any means, and I think it's along a long process, are starting to recognize more the impact of work outside of academic audiences. I know my previous employers, I used to work for one of our national science councils, work that has a real impact on government policy, for example, or investment decisions also is something that is counted. It's different, I think, in academia, but I think it is starting to change. So I think adoption of preprints is also a little bit, in some disciplines, a part of that kind of push to look more at a diversified impact pathway of work.
Yeah, I mean, maybe let's dig into that a little further. So I guess I'm curious to think about those sort of different audiences that preprints might have. And so I'm thinking of a study that was published in PLOS One last year, I think, around journalists' use of preprints, right? And you know, it was I think some worry that somehow a journalist won't know what to do with a preprint, will somehow be confused by sort of what a preprint was, and this, you know, admittedly kind of small scale qualitative study, but engaging with journalists found that no, like that distinction is marked, right? Sometimes it's sort of explained at length, sort of in a story. Sometimes it's not, but that, you know, in the same way that researchers are trying to figure out how to assess the credibility of a preprint or a published article, for that matter, you know, that other groups are doing that too. And so, yeah, I guess I'm curious, like, you know, for instance, Monica, with your work with the Open Climate Campaign, like what appetite are you seeing, you know, from stakeholders outside of academia for these different kinds of research outputs and how they're choosing to engage with them?
Yeah, I mean, the way that we frame the issue behind the Open Climate Campaign, and Anne and Emma, you're going to be very familiar with this as practitioners, is that, you know, these are researchers and knowledge producers that are working on probably the world's greatest problem, and you need that knowledge that you're producing in your, you know, academic knowledge factories to be able to be accessible so that solutions and mitigations can be generated by practitioners. And we want to emphasize the importance of making that information open so that it can be mobilized. A very concrete example from the work that we're doing at the Open Climate Campaign and from my background is national governments. So, and I'm alluded to this, you know, in the different COPs, is that the national governments and policymakers and like policy analysts go in and look at the research to write up usually a one-pager that they give to their minister, and they read this primary literature and distill it. But if they hit a paywall, or they don't have up-to-date information, that is not going to get to the decision maker or that one pager that will then help decide, you know, what kind of language should we put in that policy? Should we make it more, you know, should we have stronger language or weaker language? So preprints are sort of hit those two aspects. Like, you know, preprints are going to be accessible to that policy analyst. Like, I have worked in the Canadian government and looked up information and hit paywalls, particularly because departments and agencies don't often subscribe to the large libraries that institutions usually do. And so we want to have, as a policy analyst, you want to have access to that information to then translate that into that one pager. And you want to do it in a timely way. So while open access is really helpful, if, you know, you've got a new result from, you know, some isotope analysis that just came down from the Arctic, you want to have that as the most recent data as accessible as possible, so that can go into the negotiations and that brief that the minister gets.
Wonderfully concrete, right? To sort of imagine this one pager, right? And yeah, what ends up in it and what doesn't, right? And really the importance of access and of timely sharing as sort of making that determination. Emma, were you going to chime in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say two things in response to what Monica was saying. So I mean, that is so true around access by decision makers and policymakers. And you can imagine if the Canadian government are having difficulty accessing certain journals. I mean, how I'm often getting emails from colleagues in governments around Africa requesting particular articles because they just can't access them. Secondly, I think, yeah, well, maybe I'll talk about the COVID example in South Africa a little bit later, where, you know, preprints were just so critical for government decision making.
Just while we're on this audience's sort of theme, I guess I'm curious, and if yeah, like, are there conversations sort of within EarthArXiv that you've sort of been part of around, yeah, thinking about who the audience for EarthArXiv is, or sort of, you know, the extent to which sort of the research community and other communities are sort of stakeholders in the research that EarthArXiv is collecting and making available?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in EarthArXiv there is a lot of engagement from, as we've already mentioned, countries where maybe institutions don't have so many subscriptions, or research is more difficult to access. And you see that in the authors that are using EarthArXiv as well. I think this is really nice because I work in Nepal, where there's this, you know, the potential that Western researchers do research, take it home, start to publish it, and then, but they do, maybe a newspaper interview that says the sort of attention-grabbing disaster-like headlines, but the research itself is not available. But if we, it may not be available for a long time, even through conventional publication. So I think preprinting is really useful there in allowing the people who are most affected by research, particularly if the impact of climate change can be very rapid. So it's useful for, as well as for researchers to know the most recent results. It's also useful for people, who just live near a glacier lake. That, is it a hazard? What's people saying about this? That information should be open, even if it's still in discussion, because these discussions take a long time between many papers and many conferences and however else we discuss things.
Well, that's great. I mean, let me kind of ask maybe then a more, I don't know, to sound a cautionary note in a way. And so this isn't just sort of a preprint love fest, right? But that we're sort of, yeah, I mean, to sort of ask, are there particular sensitivities to your mind about the early sharing of climate research through preprints? And, here, I mean, I think we talked a little bit about COVID, and I think like the health sciences community is one where I think some of those concerns have been raised, right? Is it sort of responsible to share research before it's been reviewed? Of course, preprint servers like medRxiv are sort of conducting checks before sort of preprints are posted, and I think are being really mindful of that. But yeah, I guess I'm curious, in the climate space in particular. So, for instance, I'm imagining if someone is working on sort of a politically relevant, but maybe also a politically sensitive topic, right? And understands that the research is going to be, is going to get that extra level of scrutiny because of the things that they're working on. Do you see any sort of reticence on the part of climate researchers to sort of share in that way before sort of, having peer review sort of behind them to sort of hang their hat on? Or are there other sensitivities that we should be thinking about?
So I was thinking about this question quite a bit, and I have a very specific example, which would be, for example, this isn't necessarily around author reticence, but perhaps a reason to be cautious, where it's representing a study that hasn't gone through appropriate ethics approval, for example. It's something that we've been thinking about quite a lot, not just on PLOS, but also on one or two other journals on which I have editorial responsibilities. What happens if you have a study where it either hasn't gone through ethics approval, or the ethics approval has, for whatever reason, been insufficient, and it's working with a vulnerable community? Maybe there's issues around anonymity. So those are some of the times when I, as an editor, would be cautious. And I would hope that authors would themselves be cautious as well. That's a very specific example.
Yeah, I think that, you know, the naysayers of preprints will draw from a couple of examples, like, well, they're not peer reviewed, so that, you know, someone could misinterpret the information. And I think that if you compare preprints and, you know, traditional papers or like versions of record, they're both subject to errors or you know, misrepresentation of data, and also not keeping with scientific integrity. And I think that the important point or note here is that all of the concerns about scientific integrity remain, and we need to ensure that scientists just maintain to ethics, whether that is in like approval processes or, you know, they ensuring that, you know, their code has been reviewed. All of these things that you do in a traditional publication, you should also do in a preprint. There have been studies that have shown that preprints change. The difference between a preprint and like the version of record is really small, and that has been repeated a number of times and across different disciplines. We find that there are retractions in traditional publications as well. And so I think that there's, you know, there's a fear that preprints are sort of more vulnerable to errors or to misuse, but we see that happens in traditional publication outlets as well, right? Like if you want to cheat, you can do that in a traditional publication. We've seen many different ways and people have done that in very ingenious ways. So I don't think that preprints are you know, more vulnerable to that. I think we need to continue just to focus on scientific integrity and ensuring that scientists are mindful of that, and that we're going to find that in whatever system we create. And that if we have barriers in service of trying to eliminate cheats from the system, that we will make the system less equitable and less accessible. And so I think the onus just has to be on our community to maintain scientific integrity, whether it's through the preprinting process or through traditional publications.
Yeah, I agree. And I think integrity is something we hope everyone who does science has, and we have to learn to spot, which is not easy if, you know, if you're not a scientist, but it's still there in the published, you know, formal journal articles. I think the good thing about preprints, I know we're trying to look for negatives, but if the alternative, say, is a newspaper article or a blog, or, you know, something written by a journalist that maybe has a different agenda, and but the science is still a way off being published, then that becomes what is the source. And I've seen in my own research where we've talked to credible journalists, their editors have then put these sort of dramatic headlines on the work that we don't feel represents it. At least if the preprint is out there, there is that version of record from the scientist's mouth, but it is accessible, even if it's not the first thing people see.
Maybe I can give the example of so what preprints really came on my radar in a big way during COVID-19 here in South Africa, because there were these really, as in other countries, these really burning research questions. And they weren't just research questions, the government wanted, to the best of its ability, to make evidence-based decisions, and they had to do them really fast. You know, things like, are HIV positive people more vulnerable to COVID? Are people with TB more vulnerable to COVID? Because that's a very common comorbidity. We were part of one of the big vaccine trials, so 2 of the big vaccine trials, I think. So one of the reasons why I believe the Medical Research Council and the medical schools made use of preprints to such a great extent was because, and I think it's something to bear in mind, you know, I don't know, I can't speak for other countries, but during COVID-19 in South Africa, there was a tremendous amount of fake news circulating on COVID and treatments and vaccines and who was vulnerable and all of those sorts of things. Some of them haven't gone away. And so the ability to get preprints out there, even with a level of informal review, enabled government to be able to make some evidence-based decisions where they undertook their own review that I don't think they would have necessarily been able to do otherwise. I'm not so much sure about other countries, but I'm sure this does apply elsewhere.
Yes, I'm curious too, and I don't know if you can speak to this at all, but sort of about, again, I guess I'm curious how EarthArXiv might sort of approach this question when preprints are submitted to it, right? So, you know, without the, you know, the ability to sort of conduct a full review before something is posted, and that's sort of not the model. But yeah, can you tell us anything about the kinds of checks or the sorts of things that the sort of, as I understand it, they're kind of, you know, volunteer moderators of EarthArXiv. Yeah, what are EarthArXiv moderators looking for and at when a preprint comes in sort of before something is posted to the server?
Yeah, so you're right. It's if you post something to EarthArXiv, it doesn't appear immediately. So there is a moderation process to make sure it's not offensive. It's, you know, it's not biased. There is I could put the link in the. I will not read off the web. There is a moderation in terms of use policy on EarthArXiv that you can look at, which is a basic requirement. It has to be original work that isn't peer reviewed yet initially, and you have to make a statement of where you're planning to submit it. But there's also a check for that it's not inappropriate material, and that's it. It's not an assessment of scientific quality. That's not the purpose, but it's looking more widely and following up with the work later on, which should be possible to see how it's progressed through a peer review system, and if it and later citations, and see if that and that is a way of starting to assess the scientific merit of a piece of work.
That's great, thanks. Yeah, no, I think it's great to begin. I mean, at PLOS, I think something that we're thinking about is also, right, how do these kind of moderation policies or sort of procedures vary across preprint servers, right? And you know, and it's okay that they do. It's appropriate that they do, because research communities are deciding for themselves what, you know, what form of moderation is needed before a preprint is sort of ready to be engaged with by sort of others in that community. And so, yeah, we started talking a little about how do we surface those differences? How do we make them sort of legible, you know, at a glance? Yeah, so that we can sort of, you know, compare and sort of learn, you know, lessons across communities. But I think, yeah, I mean, EarthArXiv is such a great example of something that really has been community initiated and led and driven. And so I think, right, it feels important to have those policies set, you know, by researchers themselves and not sort of imposed by someone else from the outside.
And I think the advantage of EarthArXiv is it's not linked to a particular publisher. So there are other, you know, preprint servers that are, you know, are set up by or with publishers such as AGU, which have their place, but they are not. EarthArXiv is independent because it's a community resource. I think that's really nice.
Yeah. So maybe we can talk a little just before we kind of transition to that Q&A period. And so for folks who are here, if you do have questions, now would be a great moment to enter those either into the chat or into the Q&A. So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, this sort of new partnership between PLOS and EarthArXiv was in some ways kind of the occasion for kind of having this conversation and bringing people together. And you know, I recently saw a new survey of researcher attitudes toward preprints that said that integrating preprints into journal submission processes is one of the most important things that, it's one of the most important ways to encourage preprint posting. I can add actually the link to that in the chat as well. So, I found that interesting that when we think about sort of the relationship between this kind of preprint ecosystem that Monica sort of started us off with, right? Like this whole other ecosystem of sort of making knowledge accessible, and then how that interfaces with kind of the publishing system as it exists today, right? The kind of journal system that we have. These integrations seem like an interesting passage point, right, between those two ecosystems. And for those on the call who might not be familiar, so in a sense, when an author submits to PLOS Climate or to two of our other journals, PLOS Water, PLOS Sustainability and Transformation, so with a couple of extra clicks, authors can have their manuscript automatically transferred to EarthArXiv to be considered for posting as a preprint, right? So as Anne said, it's not automatically posted, it goes through that same moderation process, but the emphasis there is really on kind of ease for the author, right? That if the author hasn't gone out of their way to post a preprint already, here's a way, to just ask and to really make it easy for them to say, you might not have thought about this before, but while you're here, right, can we just sort of route this over to a preprint server for you? So I guess, both maybe Emma and Anne, I'm curious to just, get your sense of like, how is this going, right? How is this partnership going so far from the journal side, from the preprint server side? And then Monica, I'd love to bring you in as well. And what are other things that maybe publishers or other stakeholders could do to kind of promote the coupling of those two ecosystems, right? How do we make them less separate and more joined up with one another?
Well, maybe I can kick off from the point of view of PLOS Climate. So PLOS Climate is, well, how old are we now? We're just over a year old. We're not quite a toddler, but, and so since the launch, we've seen about 26% of the PLOS Climate authors opting into that facilitated transfer to facilitated posting at submission. And if I look through to the end of the year, I think we're going to see that. I think we're definitely going to see that increase. I think it'll take a while for more and more authors to realize that that's a possibility and to realize what a kind of useful option it is. There are also some meetings coming up focused on open climate science. So there's one coming up in Kigali in October, where PLOS Climate is going to be represented. We're doing some work with early career researchers there. And I'm really looking forward to seeing if preprints are a part of the discussion there. I know we'll talk about it in our session, and it'll be great for us to have a chance to talk about it, and also with early career researchers as an option for them.
And from the EarthArXiv side, I checked the numbers this afternoon. Or this morning, wherever you are today, and there's 34 manuscripts have been transmitted from PLOS to EarthArXiv since this connection started, and 28 of those have been published on EarthArXiv. I'm not sure how many have also been published through PLOS, but they are, it's working, and I think making it an easy thing to do is definitely a good idea. I really like that the publisher has joined with a community-driven preprint server rather than set up their own. I think that's a good move.
Definitely. The one other thing I'll say, and Monica, I want to bring you into, is just that I think another conversation we're having within PLOS is, are there other PLOS journals where a partnership like this would be valuable, right? And so we have existing partnerships with bioRxiv and with medRxiv. But I've had conversations with editors on journals beyond the three that are currently offering this feature, sort of saying, we'd like to have this too, and we have authors for whom this would be useful. So that's something my team, the open research team, is working on, is to in a sense figure out what we need to do to sort of scale that on the PLOS side, and of course then to make sure on the EarthArXiv side that that there's that buy-in. To expand that further as well. But I think, right, it feels like for EarthArXiv, this was sort of the first first publishing partnership of that kind to sort of have these direct transfers. And, you know, I think we'll be really curious to see if there are others to follow. I mean, yeah, I think, you know, certainly within PLOS, but beyond that too, I think it's exciting to think about more partnerships of that kind.
Yeah, that's really exciting to hear, because I think as you know, when you make announcements like this, where you have that direct transfer, I think that adds to the confidence that the scientific community will have for preprints and lessen the fear. Even just 5 years ago, there was fears from the scientific community that if I posted a preprint or engaged in preprint practices, that a journal would not allow me to then publish in their outlet. You know, and often we would then, you know, send them to the journal policies or use Sherpa Romeo for you to find those out, but those policies changed. And so when you start to see that journals are automatically helping you deposit that preprint, it increases the confidence in the practice, you know, as a whole. And just also, yeah, it will increase the numbers of preprints being deposited for the reasons that we just talked about, mainly that it's easier. I've spent a lot of the last couple of years thinking about how do we get researchers or knowledge producers to take up open practices, and particularly open access. And many of the times when you have these conversations with researchers, you know, they believe in these ideas and they want to. They have so many constraints on their time. And so it's not that they don't want to practice, it's that, you know, the incentive structure isn't really set up for me to go beyond me submitting my paper to a journal, because that's what I'm going to get credited for, and that's how I'm going to be assessed. And so in the work that, you know, I've been doing the last couple of years, my mindset has shifted from like, oh, it's just a matter of telling people to do these things, but thinking about how can we facilitate these practices? How can we make it the absolute easiest for people to do the thing that they do really want to do, but don't have time to do? And so I often point to these automatic transfers that journals are starting to have for preprints, because that's a really easy way for someone to participate in an open practice and an open access. I'll end with maybe throwing it back to you, Marcel, and asking, you know, would PLOS be ever interested in sort of taking a leadership role and seeing, is there a consortium of journals that could come together and say, we are, you know, pledging to have an automatic transfer when someone wants to submit, that there is an opt-in, because the infrastructure is there for preprints for sure. And, you know, the back end you folks control through your like manuscript submission process. And I think making that connection, I mean, most of these preprint servers have, you know, APIs that would make it very easy to transfer the preprints over. I think it just needs, like, you know, yeah, to have some leadership to bring in all these journals that are interested, or maybe some that are like worried, oh, how do we do it? To have like a consortium that has pledged to do it. That would be really cool to see, I think.
Yeah, I know. I think that's a really interesting idea. My sense is that, right, that where it's happened, you know, with bioRxiv or medRxiv, that perhaps it's been more sort of individual publishers, individual journals sort of doing that. But it is interesting to think, yeah, you know, how to make that visible as sort of a best practice across sort of scholarly publishing, right? And to sort of say that that's something that yeah, that you could sort of do in a collective way, and sort of make that visible as an option in a collective way. I'm curious too, Monica. I mean, you know, a little bit of your work around pre-review. Are there ways that, so, you know, this is sort of another kind of, you know, preprint initiative, you know, that specifically is thinking about sort of attaching reviews to preprints, you know, alongside the journal system in some ways. And so I guess I'm curious from pre-review's perspective, yeah, those connection points with the journal system, is that something that is important to pre-review? Is that something that, yeah, how do you think about that?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the motivations of why we started pre-review, because there's a recognition that there is an insufficient number of reviewers, and that we can increase the pool of reviewers. We can diversify the pool of reviewers, and then offer that to publishers as a means to increase, the probability that they're going to get sufficient reviews for their manuscript. And so we've enabled that in a couple of different ways. One is, for example, we have a partnership right now with JMIR, where we're doing these live preprint journal clubs, which are basically like a call like this, but we collaboratively review a preprint, and pre-review moderates and facilitates the discussion, and we go through a template discussing the preprint, and then that gets turned into a review that then gets added to the other reviews that they've solicited through like the traditional peer review process. And publishers can also go in just to our preprint review platform and pull reviews from there and use them as part of their review process as well. And so we've thought very much about, how can we integrate this like larger pool of reviewers that we're trying to solicit into sort of the more traditional workflow of publishers, so that from the pre-reviews perspective, we're getting voices that are often sort of marginalized in traditional peer review, but the positive for publishers is that they get more reviews, which I know is a consistent issue when speaking to editors, when speaking to publishers. So and there's things that need to be considered, like how do we ensure that these reviewers are trained and are have the expertise. And so there's some so part of also what peer review does is think about, we're training these reviewers so that they're equipped to do good reviews for journals.
Emma, I guess I'm curious, like, would initiatives like that make your life easier as an editor? Or how do you think about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not on PLOS, but on another journal, I think we have a record number of declines on one of the papers for which we're trying to get reviews, like 15 or 16. So something like that would just be so helpful. It really would.
Great to hear. Well, I'm just mindful of time. I see that we're sort of getting to the close of the hour. So I'll just kind of extend the invitation again. If there are folks here who haven't maybe had a chance to ask a question yet, this would be a great moment to do that. Again, I'll just remind us for those that might have joined late. So we'll also post this recording to the PLOS YouTube channel and share it out with registered attendees. It's been a really rich conversation. And if there isn't one, I mean, maybe my closing question just to the group would be, in a way, like, what would your hope be in this space over the next, if it's 3 to 5 years, but if we've sort of talked about how far we've come in this sort of recent period, maybe the answer is just more of this, more of what we've been talking about, and that's great. That's a great answer in its own right. But are there specific things that you would sort of hope to see or wish for as far as adoption of preprints, or maybe about the usefulness of preprints in this climate research space?
So I can think of a couple of things specifically. I mean, first of all, obviously, we'd like to see the trend of opting in PLOS climate to carry on increasing, and we expect that. I would like to see more early career researchers doing it. I have a particular interest in seeing early career research trying to get out there, trying to get more visibility. I think this is a great way to do that. And then last of all, in terms of usability, which you raised specifically, Marcella, I would love to see this trend of opting in for preprints to equate to increased impact of research outside of traditional audiences, and hopefully in a really trackable and measurable way.
Yeah, just to add to that, I would love to see an increase in the use of preprints where it becomes kind of just a default. At the Open Climate Campaign, our ultimate goal from this 4-year project is to have the open sharing of research outputs the norm in climate science. And preprints, I think, is a really good way to achieve that, and that you could still do that in concert with any other. And I love that argument about preprints is that, like, you can still follow a traditional publishing pathway, but the default should always be like you're going to preprint, and to do it in hopefully through a journal that facilitates that process. And then the additional aspect that I think that we should also be thinking about is what kind of licensing are we putting around these preprints so that we can use them to their maximum potential, right? So that we allow reuse rights so that they can be translated, so that we allow text and data mining so that they can be used to their fullest potential. And hopefully that's something that we'll talk more about, and hopefully some work that Creative Commons will get into, because having the right license will also sort of enable preprints to do even more.
Yeah, and what I really like to see, which I think is starting in my field and hopefully more developed in others, is for researchers submitting papers or making them into preprints with the expectation that the community will engage with discussion of them, and they will discuss each other's papers as preprints, rather than go through this laborious publish reply model, that can take a long time. We will be open to there being more than 2 or 3 people commenting on our papers, and we will jump in and say, even with small suggestions to other people's preprints, and say this would be a really good thing to help you, or could you fix this before you go further with it? It would be brilliant to be more engaged in that way.
That's great. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. We're just getting to the close of our time here, but I just want to extend my thanks to Emma and to Anne and to Monica for being part of this conversation today. My colleague James at PLOS has sort of been on the back end, sort of supporting this in an organizational capacity. So James, thanks to your help on that. And yeah, for those of you who were able to join us on the call, for those of you who are sort of hearing this at a later date, would just really invite you to stay engaged kind of in this conversation, both as PLOS, as EarthArXiv, as the Open Climate Campaign are sort of helping to shape it, but yeah, to sort of engage with us and with preprints more broadly. It's an exciting space right now, as I think we've had a chance to talk about today. Yeah, thanks everyone here. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.